Thank you, guys, and thank you, everybody, again for the opportunity to share some of our experience from events in London. As Jeremy said yesterday when he first contacted me to come over and share some of our experience of the bombings, that was over a year ago, and obviously since that period we've had quite a number of events in London. So quite purposefully the title of this lecture has slightly changed from sticking with bomb and blast to touch a little bit upon London's plans for mass casualty type incidents and also to look a little bit about the threat of marauding terrorists, and we'll run through a couple of the events that happened earlier this year in London. So as part of that, we're going to touch a little bit upon the emergency planning framework for London. We will look at the enhancements that are there within the EPRR framework for ballistic type events, touching on marauding terrorist threat, and hopefully looking at potential solutions for the future. So just by way of background, I thought it would be worthwhile just describing a little bit about the trauma system in London. And there you can see on display there a map of London which displays the 4 trauma networks. And in all of those networks there's usually a centre, a major trauma centre here, which has maybe half a dozen or more trauma units that are attached to it and feed into that major trauma centre. But I think there is a bit of a word of caution about everything focusing on major trauma networks, because as we've just heard with the previous 2 speakers, terrorism and major incidents doesn't always involve blunt trauma. And actually, I think it's very, very true to say that the systems that are in place in terms of networks to deal with non-trauma major incidents is still very primitive, and we're very much reliant and focused on the trauma networks for giving us some sort of structure on how to respond. But of course, in terms of getting the physicians involved, I don't know if you have the same problem in Australasia, but getting the physicians involved in major incident management and preparedness is not an easy thing, and something that we really need to get a grip of moving forward. So delivering the response from a healthcare point of view is the responsibility of London Ambulance Service, which is a reasonably large organisation, probably one of the biggest and busiest ambulance services in the world. And this slide just really describes how big that organisation is. It does have some specialist resources on the right-hand side of this slide, including our own team from the air ambulance, but there are also hazardous area rescue teams, advanced paramedic practitioners, tactical response units, motorcycle response units, cycle response units, you name it. If you can ride it or drive it, they turn it into some sort of emergency vehicle in London. And there's also a physician response unit, which is primarily directed around admissions avoidance. And our service actually only has 1 helicopter that's operational in London, which has a senior doctor and senior paramedic on it. Doesn't operate at night. It's replaced at night by a response car system, which also operates in bad weather and the location around the hospital if the distances are too short to fly. So the major incident framework, well, in the UK, emergency planning has sort of been replaced by a trendy term of EPRR, emergency preparedness, resilience and response. And as part of that framework, obviously every hospital has a major incident plan. We touched upon that yesterday. And supporting those plans are plans within the community and the primary care trusts, the GPs and what have you. And then there is the plans from the emergency services. And I'm going to talk in the next slide about this plan, the LESLEP plan, which is a sort of combination of all the emergency services plans pulled together. On top of the standard major incident plan for London, there is a pan-London MCI plan, a mass casualty incident plan, which we'll touch on a little bit more detail as we move forward. But the context of those plans are based in thousands upon thousands of casualties, as opposed to the hundreds that you might see in a more sort of traditional major incident in London. And within those the plans for London, each trauma network, those 4 networks that you saw in one of the preceding slides, they all have to have their own mass casualty plans to deal with large volumes of patients. In amongst this is our resilience forums that have plans that essentially bring in the plans from more community-based services and the councils and water and electricity and what have you that provide a sort of resilience framework around the acutely responding providers. And on the side there are the CBRM plans that obviously form part of the overall framework, and hospitals as well as the emergency services are required to have some sort of CBRM capability. So I mentioned this document here, which is, I think, quite a unique document if you look at it from a global context, because essentially it's a tri-service document. It's something that the police, the fire and the ambulance service subscribe to, which you're probably sat there thinking, well, yeah, that's pretty damn sensible, I suppose. But actually, if you go around the world, it is pretty rare to find countries or indeed individual cities that have a document like that, where all the 3 emergency services have actually sat down and said, this is what we're going to do. This is what it's going to look like. This is the language that we're going to use. So for all of the services, they use this similar command structure of bronze, silver, gold, which I'm sure you're probably familiar in your own plans. But one of the other unique elements of this is that some of the utilities and things like the railways are now bought into this document, so that if you go to a major train crash, it will actually have a very similar command structure on scene, so that if you're in a silver level meeting, you'll actually know who the person who's responsible for the rail network will be there. They will have the same sort of title and command structure below them and above them. So within that structure, I'm sure you're familiar with this, there are gold groups that include the fire, police and ambulance, then the silver, and then down at a bronze sort of operational level, those are the teams that are on scene trying to deal with the incident. And although this all sounds quite cute and easy to write down, actually, I think in our experience, getting this group to meet actually at the incident is one of the biggest challenges, because the police are often focused on what their primary role is, the fire service may be focused on their primary objectives, and it isn't unusual for it to take an hour or several hours to get this group together. But of course, if you don't get that group together, the incident will go off the rails. It won't work. You need all of the services working together to produce a sort of operational plan at the coalface. From a health point of view, the ambulance service will have an incident commander at the scene, and he or she will be supported by a medical advisor, which is a physician, and he or she will have a tactical advisor from the emergency planning department supporting them in their decision making. So for major incidents, the enhancements that are there for the ambulance service are these medical advisors, and you can see this as they stick out a bit like a sore thumb here, wearing orange in this case. This was at a large exercise just recently in London. And some of those doctors not only support to the ambulance service, but they may help make up merit teams, which are a physician and paramedic team who will work in part of the infrastructure of the major incident. They may be the casualty clearing area, they might be forward treating patients in the wreckage of a train crash or a building collapse or what have you. And obviously, like every major incident plan, there are specialist vehicles and comms vehicles that attend the scene. So let's sort of move on and talk about mass casualty incidents. And this is one of the definitions sort of used in the UK. But ostensibly, it refers to a set of circumstances where even your standard major incident response is not going to be good enough. It isn't going to cut it for patients, and you're going to have to make further enhancements of the healthcare infrastructure and response to make things work. And sort of by definition, for us in the UK and in London, the MCI plan is focused on a major incident that is sudden impact, so not really in the context of a biological event. This is really focused around, can you say traditional major incident? I'm not sure if you can, but the sort of typical major incident that we've had in London that happens over a course of a period of minutes and may go on for several hours, and is conventional in nature in the sense that it will produce multiple injury and blunt trauma, or maybe penetrating trauma, and is probably going to be multi-sited, that it isn't going to be one big event, and it will produce around 2,000 patients or more than 2,000 patients. And I think it's really important to think about that number of patients, because it's only when you start to think about 2,000 patients that you really have to change your mindset on how you're going to work. And for intensive care, how are you going to have all the same standards if you have 3 or 4 times the number of patients requiring ventilatory support under your care? So if you have 40 and suddenly you need 200, you really have to change the sort of thinking around the monitoring, the type of ventilators that you're going to use, and how you're going to treat those patients. And certainly from our point of view, we've excluded CBRN in the context of these plans. And of course, there is national, regional, and local guidance and trauma network guidance for these mass casualty incidents. So I thought it might be worth just touching upon a few of the basic concepts of major incidents and how they might change in a mass casualty incident. And we did touch upon this yesterday in terms of triage. We mentioned yesterday that it is really important to have some sort of Jedi doing the triage, someone really senior, someone experienced. Well, in the case of major mass casualty incidents, I think that is even more important. It is not the triage of P1 to P3. It's P1 triage, and is very much like a busy emergency department. If you've ever been to any of the exercises that try to mimic these scale things, you really have to be able to run and triage patients, hundreds of patients that may be in your emergency department, and prioritize them. And that's a sort of unique skill that not every ambulance personnel or ambulancemen can step forward and suddenly start thinking about how they're going to triage 100 P1 casualties. That is a pretty specialist initiative. And of course that involves dropping the triage tool, which becomes virtually ineffective. And certainly in London, the ambulance service have a triage tool that tell you to go to either a major trauma centre or a trauma unit. That becomes ineffective in this context. And indeed, you might need to think about the concept of reverse triage, doing things the opposite way that you're used to doing it. So, for example, someone who's been shot in the head in London would normally be triaged to a major trauma centre. But if you're at an event with a marauding terrorist, firearms incidents, and you've got multiple patients that have been shot in the head, patients that may have transcranial wounds, you might consider just sending to a trauma unit rather than a major trauma centre in terms of their likely outcome. So a concept that actually is very difficult for more junior people to come to terms with, but perhaps with seniority it's something that you could do. And we touched upon this yesterday about using multiple vehicles per patient and using buses and what have you to get patients to where they are actually needed. So, the trauma units, I touched upon those earlier on. The modus operandi for them normally is to stabilise. If a patient comes into them and they require treatment at the major trauma centre, they will be transferred. But in the context of an MCI, actually trauma units become de facto major trauma centres. So they actually have to accept those patients, they have to treat those patients, and they have to admit those patients. And they have to do that with decision-making support from the major trauma centres and have basically connections with the major trauma centre surgeons, allowing the surgeons in those hospitals to undertake surgery that they're not necessarily that used to carrying out. And likewise, you get similar support from other networks and regions outside of London. People always talk about tents in mass casualty situations, and I think there's a big question as to how helpful they are, because all you end up with is an emergency department that has no equipment actually at the incident, and that really putting your efforts into maintaining flow and getting patients away from the scene, be it to a trauma unit or a major trauma centre, is the most important thing. And in particular, you know, we've seen recently the need to move patients quickly in the context of penetrating injury. It's obviously not a place for critical care type interventions and things like REBOA, but one important difference, I think, is in the training, that we have to shape the training for mass casualty incidents very differently, that actually we have to be able to train people to fail, that actually it is unlikely to go that well. And one of the major problems in terms of psychological fallout of major incidents is people not doing what they thought they were expected to do, it not happening according to plan. And actually one of the things that we've been training our staff to do is accept that it won't go right. And you can't expect it to go right if all of a sudden you have 2,000 patients in front of you, maybe 100, 200 people who've been shot in the head or the chest. You're not going to get it right. And these are important concepts to get over to staff, and that they need to think about not coping and knowing that they'll be off plan and there isn't necessarily a plan to follow in some of these circumstances, and allowing them to do what they feel is right. Because we can't predict every situation. So when we have teams that are going out, particularly to these sort of marauding terrorist situations, we have to give them some degree of autonomy and make sure that they feel supported, that they're not going to be criticised when they were in a very difficult position, that we recognise as the seniors in the organisation that these will be incredibly difficult scenarios that very few people on the planet have actually had to face, and they need that support. And all they can do is focus really on flow and keeping things moving and getting patients to any hospital in the context of a true MCI. And lastly, reminding them, do what you can live with. Do what you feel that you'll be able to sleep with at night, not what some plan said you should do. And we've had, put this slide up yesterday, there's been plenty of evidence where actually people sticking to plans have come under huge criticism, not just from the media and from families, but also from coroners, where actually they were literally lambasted for sticking to the book, that actually there should have been a bit more freedom in their actions. So let's move on and we'll talk a bit about the marauding terrorist firearms attack, which is something that I suppose came into existence a few years ago after events like Mumbai, and I'm sure everyone is familiar with this picture of the terrorists there shooting in the railway station and in the hotel. And London has a few things they've put in place to deal with this in the context of specialist paramedics and specialist firemen, and a specialist plan to deal with it. And there is also sort of an emphasis on how the public should react in these sorts of situations. So from a paramedic point of view, we now have these TRUs, Tactical Response Units, who are a group of paramedics that train regularly with the police. They have ballistic protection, as you can see here, that is analogous with the police. They provide very little in the way of clinical care. It's basically care under fire from a military point of view. They deliver tourniquets and dressings, and they're operating in the warm zone. And we'll just touch upon what the warm zone is in a few minutes. Supporting them are a group of specialist firemen who are there to try and move patients who've been triaged by the TRUs and are moved rapidly out of the warm zone, hopefully into a colder area where physician teams and the wider ambulance service is waiting to re-triage and treat the patients at a casualty clearing area. This is the basis of the advice given to the general public, the run, hide, tell, and I'm sure many of you have seen this has been enacted by many hundreds of people in London over the summer at the two events at Westminster and at London Bridge. So the original term was marauding terrorist, firearms attack, but as you've seen, or you'll see in the next few slides, actually, this is just about a marauding terrorist, that actually marauding terrorists don't just have to have firearms to cause mayhem. We've had a marauding terrorist here who attacked an off-duty soldier with his colleague. So it isn't just guns. Terrorists are using knives, and we've seen that around the world. They're using vehicles, and from their point of view, using them very effectively. In Nice, 87 people killed, 430 people injured. In Berlin, 12, 11 plus one, the one being the driver, the terrorists themselves, and 56 people injured. And this we showed yesterday. This is one of the events in London where a terrorist is driving up the side of this bridge, and you can see the true speed with which he was driving down the pavement there, and you can see one of the patients there just being skittled over the side of the bridge and into the water. And you can see that these are very difficult problems to deal with, because this terrorist event was over in about 80 seconds. From getting onto the bridge and getting to the policeman where he was stabbed, all happened in just over a minute. And it isn't just knives and vehicles. It gets more complex than that. You can see here the three of the marauding terrorists at London Bridge. Not only did they use their vehicle to run down innocent pedestrians, when they got out of the vehicle, in this case they were wearing improvised explosive devices, so they were wearing these on their belts. They weren't actually bombs, but in the vehicle they had all of these petrol cans and had sort of Molotov cocktails all prepared with gas burners to start lobbing at people. So actually nowadays you have to think of absolutely everything in this context, not just blunt trauma, but penetrating trauma and the potential for burns injury on top of everything. So I talked a little bit about the plan for the marauding terrorist, and the theory is this, that there is a hot zone, and in that hot zone the police are active and they're shooting or trying to eliminate the threat that's out there. There is a warm zone where there is no shooting, and this is where the specialist paramedics are there to do that quick treat and triage, and there is a cold zone where effectively it is thought to be safe, and that's where the casualty clearing area is, and that's where the patients will be re-triaged and get perhaps an enhanced clinical care at that point. But there is a problem with all of this. This fulfills the old paradigm of major incidents where there are zones and there's tape and you have a defined area. The problem is with the marauding terrorist defining those zones because they are basically moving, and who is it's going to declare where this zone is and declare one zone becoming hot and moving to cold. And that's one of the big challenges for us. And we've seen this in major incident exercises of this nature. Operation Strong Tower a couple of years ago was one of them. And it exemplified some very real problems, which is the reluctance to declare an area safe, a reluctance to drop normal working patterns, difficulties with communicating when the firearms teams are moving forward and they're not looking back, they're just moving forward to eliminate the threat. They don't see it as their job to define these zones. Actually, that has to be picked up by someone else. And we talked a little bit about the issues of potential secondary devices yesterday in that context. So this is the sort of paradigm that we have firearms teams moving forward. We've got specialist paramedics, we've got rescue teams, but actually there is a real issue in this gap here. How do we actually manage that? And this is one new approach that we are looking at actually is having physicians embedded in firearms teams moving forward with them, so that they're not just moving forward, they are also treating and looking back and helping the healthcare system behind have a clarity on where is warm and where is effectively hot. So these special operations medical advisors are a group of doctors that work and train with firearms teams, and they go forward with these teams. They wear ballistic protection, and this concept mimics most special forces throughout the world. Nowadays, most special forces will have medics and physicians embedded in those teams on active duties. And these SOMA operatives is the norm in the USA, norm in France, Denmark and Finland. It's not something that's unique. I'm not aware that you have that capability here in Australia or New Zealand, but we don't actually have it in London at the moment, but it's something that we are working towards given the problems that we've had with these exercises and recent events. And you can see here, this is Johns Hopkins University. They are now running a fellowship in tactical medicine, which, as you can see here, aims to give leadership, field support and medical direction to law enforcement, special operations and tactical medicine programs. So this isn't something that is off the wall. It's embedded in some countries and something that you might want to consider here. And this is another website that describes the same thing. So very quickly, sorry I'm running a little bit late, I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of those events from the summer, and this is Westminster. You can see Big Ben here, and this is the bridge. And effectively this terrorist drove his car, and you saw the car coming down the pavement here, and he eventually crashed it in this area and got out of the car wielding knives, and then ran into the Palace of Westminster here, assaulting a police officer and fatally wounding him. And these are just some of the images of that day. For our team, this happened, and this is their perspective. It happened at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and the team were dispatched to what they thought was a road traffic accident. So a lot of these events don't begin as a marauding terrorist, they now begin as a simple car crash. And the team that day were actually 2 doctors on the helicopter and a senior paramedic. were on scene at 14:56. And of course, we're in a very difficult situation because they were ushered in to tend for this policeman who was dying, had several stab wounds to the thorax, and obviously that to some degree hampered their ability to take on the major incident infrastructure and deal with it in a traditional way. But they very quickly moved one of them to deal with the major incident infrastructure and the other two to tend to the policeman, as he was still with signs of life when they got to him. So it was effectively two scenes, one on the bridge, one in the Palace of Westminster here. The car was crashed in this region, so there were a few patients that had been run over at this point. And then there were two patients in the Palace of Westminster that the team had to go to, and that's a picture of the team tending the policeman. You can see his legs up here, and this is the terrorist that was being dealt with here. He'd been shot by the police at this point and was just undergoing CPR. That's the car where it crashed. And actually, I'm going to move on very quickly because I realise I'm going out of time. But actually, for the teams on that particular event, there was a bomb scare in the middle of it, so actually they couldn't move up and down the actual bridge. There was a package here that was considered to be a bomb, so actually the whole bridge had to be evacuated for a period of time whilst that was dealt with, and once that was neutralised and realised it wasn't a genuine threat, they could continue trying to tend for the patients, and you can see this is the sort of imagery of the situation that they were trying to deal with. I'll skip that because it's simply a video going over it. I'm just going to give you a few sentences about the London Bridge attack. I've already talked about the fact that they had incendiary devices in the car that they were intending to use. In this particular incident, the terrorists had driven up this orange path here. They then turned around, came down the bridge, on and off the pavement, hitting bystanders, and eventually crashed the car at this point here. They then went on foot in two routes into what was called Borough Market, which is an area, well, a bit like round here actually, where there's lots of restaurants and what have you. It's a big social gathering area of an evening, and they were then regrouped somewhere in here. They come out of a door here and they walk up this street, and here you can see them walking up the street. Three of them. Knives in their hand.
Yeah. I was then trying to get them into the pub.
Yeah. When they attack him, they just go up to him.
So they try to
try stabbing him.
They attack this guy with knives here.
You
can see the police arrive, engage with the terrorists very quickly.
And he gets shot, bang, bang. And he gets shot, bang, bang.
Down.
Yeah, got him. Down. He got up and run.
Yeah.
So I don't think they got him. Or they probably did
stab him somewhere. Cut him up. Right.
Yeah. No, they're all fucking free down.
Sorry about the language. You sort of agree with them, don't you? But you can see how quickly these happened, how dynamic the situations were. For our team, they were sent to this incident. It was split into two sectors. Sorry, I'm pressing the wrong button here. This is the area that you saw all of that happening, a south sector. This is London Bridge. And this is the north sector where we were treating patients. And these are the timings for the event. 999 call was about 8 minutes past 10. The team were mobile at 16 minutes, so 8 minutes later. They went to the first RVP, which is off this map, but the second RVP was here at the north end of this bridge, and we were met with patients that were being moved, either carried by other members of the public, some patients actually having CPR on the walkway here. It was interrupted, essentially the casualty clearing area was up here, but it was interrupted by reports of another shooter at this area here, so the teams all had to move south on the bridge for protection until this area was cleared, and then they could move back to the casualty area. You can see here that actually it was, although those 3 terrorists were shot, it was originally thought there were 5, that 2 more had gone out of the vehicle. And actually that's why Special Forces were called in, and they landed on the bridge at 23:43. But the big challenge for all of us is the last slide, you'll be glad to hear, in all of this is the therapeutic vacuum, that actually getting access to these patients, we're still not clear, because this is part of a coronial investigation of those patients that died, what sort of injuries they had, whether they had lethal injuries, or was it the fact that they were stuck in a hot zone that prevented them from getting the appropriate level of care. And we still don't know from places like Paris or from Las Vegas exactly what that therapeutic vacuum looks like. And when we do know what that vacuum looks like, actually the need for SOMA operatives or what have you in a hot zone may be a little bit clearer. So I'm sorry I've gone well over, do apologise, but hopefully you've got a bit of a feel for mass casualty incidents and what's happened in London. Thank you for your attention.